The night was dark and stormy, rain tapping against the windows like a rhythmic whisper. In a quiet studio apartment on the third floor, everything seemed ordinary, until it wasn't. It started with a soft tapping at the window. At first, she ignored it, brushing it off as the wind. But the sound didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock felt deliberate, too precise to be natural. And then, she saw him. A boy, pale as the moonlight, with eyes black and bottomless, staring back at her through the glass. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. What was he? A ghost? Something darker? What started as a faint knock became a nightmare she couldn't escape. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales. Tonight, we unravel a story so chilling it'll make you question what's lurking outside your own window. It began with a sound so faint, so innocuous, that at first, she barely noticed it. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, nor was it alarming. Just the kind of sound you might hear on a breezy night, like a branch brushing against the glass or a bird landing lightly on the windowpane. Living on the third floor of her building, she had grown used to the quiet solitude, the small creaks of the structure settling, the occasional hum of passing traffic below. That night, she had been sitting on the couch, a book open in her lap, the warm glow of a single lamp casting long shadows against the walls. The tap came again, just once this time. She looked up, her eyes darting to the window. Nothing. The curtain swayed slightly in the draft, the soft fabric curling inward as if nudged by invisible fingers. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination, and turned back to her book. The next night, it came again. This time, she was in bed, just on the edge of sleep, when the tapping pulled her back. Tap, tap, tap. The same steady rhythm, like a polite knock, neither hurried nor aggressive. She opened her eyes, her heart beating a little faster as she lay there in the dark. The window was just across the room, the pale glow of the moon filtering through the sheer curtains. It felt like it was beckoning her, daring her to get up and look. But she didn't move. She lay perfectly still, her ears straining for any other sound. Maybe it was the wind, she thought again, though the air outside had been calm all day. Or perhaps a bird. Yes, that made sense. A bird, or maybe a bat, confused by the reflection of the glass. She told herself this over and over until, finally, her breathing slowed and she fell into an uneasy sleep. But in the morning, she found herself glancing at the window, the thought still nagging at the edges of her mind. There was nothing unusual there. No smudge, no feather, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. And yet, the unease lingered, like a faint stain she couldn't scrub away. On the third night, the sound returned. Tap, tap, tap. She had been waiting for it, her nerves taut, every muscle in her body on edge. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind it wanted her to know it was there. She sat up in bed, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling in the silence. Of course, there was no answer. Only the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. She slid out of bed, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. Slowly, she approached the window, her heart pounding in her chest. With each step, the sound seemed to grow louder, echoing in her ears. Her fingers hesitated on the edge of the curtain, trembling as she gripped the fabric. What would she see when she pulled it back? A bird. A branch? Or something else entirely? She took a deep breath and yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. The street below was quiet, bathed in the dim orange glow of the streetlights. The window was locked, as it always was, and there wasn't a single sign of anything out of place. She let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over her. "I'm losing it," she muttered to herself, pulling the curtains closed once more. But as she turned to head back to bed, she froze. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Louder now, more insistent, as if mocking her for daring to ignore it. She didn't sleep that night. The boy didn't stop. Every night, at the same time, the knocking returned. Tap, tap, tap. It was always the same, steady, deliberate. The rhythm had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, though far more unsettling. No matter how tightly she drew the curtains, no matter how securely she locked the windows, the sound always found her. And with it, the voice. "Won't you let me in?" At first, it was just the words, spoken slowly, almost pleadingly, in that rasping, guttural tone that didn't belong to a child. But then, something changed. The words lingered in her mind long after they were spoken, echoing in the quiet moments of her day, as though the boy had found a way inside. Not her home, but her thoughts. She started hearing the voice in places where it shouldn't have been. In the hum of her refrigerator late at night, in the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, even in the rhythmic ticking of the clock. "Won't you let me in?" It was everywhere, an unshakable presence that filled her with dread. Her life began to unravel. She stopped seeing her friends, ignoring their calls and texts. What could she tell them? That she was being haunted by a boy with black, soulless eyes? That his voice followed her wherever she went? They'd think she was crazy. Maybe she was. Her paranoia grew. She triple-checked every lock before bed, her hands shaking as she turned each latch. She moved furniture in front of the windows, stacking chairs and boxes like barricades. But it didn't matter. The knocking always came, unbothered by her futile attempts at defense. During the day, things weren't much better. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It didn't matter where she was, at the grocery store, walking down the street, or even sitting in her own living room. She felt his gaze, heavy and unrelenting, as though he were standing just out of sight, waiting for her to turn around. She started to see him in her mind's eye, even when he wasn't there. His pale, waxy skin, his wet, matted hair, and those eyes, those impossibly black, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce through her every time she thought about them. And then there were the whispers. They started faintly, almost imperceptible, just beneath the sound of the tapping. At first, she couldn't make out the words. They were like fragments of a language she didn't know, disjointed and otherworldly. But soon, they became clearer. "Won't you let me in?" Her name followed, spoken in the same rasping, unnatural voice. She would hear it at odd times, while she was brushing her teeth, cooking dinner, or even lying in bed, clutching the covers tightly around her. The sound seemed to seep into her bones, making her feel cold, no matter how many layers she wore. Her world became smaller. She stopped leaving her apartment altogether. Every time she even thought about stepping outside, she imagined him waiting for her, just around the corner, or at the bottom of the stairs, grinning that unervingly wide grin. She stayed inside, curtains drawn, doors locked, trying to convince herself that she was safe. But deep down, she knew better. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It didn't matter what time of day it was anymore. Morning, noon, or night, it would start, always the same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. And then, one day, it changed. The taps became heavier, more forceful, as though the boy was pounding on the glass with his fists. The sound reverberated through her small apartment, making the walls tremble. And the whispers, those low, haunting murmurs, grew louder too, filling the space until it felt like they were coming from everywhere at once. She screamed, covering her ears, trying to block it all out. But the sound was inside her now, vibrating through her skull like a relentless drumbeat. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. Her fear consumed her. She could barely think, barely function. Was this a ghost? A hallucination? Or something far worse? She didn't know. And she was too scared to find out. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. She slept with the lights on, though she barely slept at all. When she did, her dreams were filled with him, standing at her window, hanging upside down, grinning that wide, wicked grin as he whispered her name. She wanted it to stop. She needed it to stop. But no matter what she did, no matter how much she begged or prayed, the boy wouldn't go away. He was always there, just beyond the glass, waiting. And she was running out of places to hide. Some knocks at the window are better left unanswered. But if you're brave enough to keep listening, subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. Who knows? The next story might be knocking just for you. It was a gray, rainy afternoon, the kind of day that seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute dragging into the next. She was at work, wiping down tables at the cafe where she spent her afternoons trying to escape the suffocating confines of her apartment. The steady hum of customers and the clinking of cups against saucers should have been comforting, a distraction from the dread that had consumed her life. But even here, in the noise and warmth of the cafe, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She had grown used to it by now, the prickling sensation of unseen eyes boring into her. It had followed her everywhere, the grocery store, the laundromat, even the library. She told herself it was all in her head, a product of her fraying nerves. But deep down, she knew better. She could feel him, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting. As she worked, her eyes kept drifting to the large glass windows at the front of the cafe. The rain streamed down in steady rivulets, blurring the view of the street outside. She couldn't see anything clearly, just vague shapes of people rushing past, umbrellas held high against the downpour. But still, her unease grew. She wiped the same table 3 times, her hands trembling slightly, her breathing shallow. And then it happened. She glanced up, and her heart stopped. There he was. The boy. Standing in the middle of the street, just beyond the window, completely still. The rain poured down on him, soaking his pale skin and matting his dirty hair against his forehead. His clothes clung to his frail frame, but he didn't seem to notice the cold or the wet. He was staring directly at her. His black eyes were just as she remembered, vast, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. And his grin, it stretched wider than should have been possible, a cruel, knowing smile that sent a jolt of terror through her body. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, watching her, as though he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Her blood turned to ice. She dropped the cloth she'd been holding, her mind racing. The cafe seemed to fade around her. The hum of conversation, the clinking of dishes, even the sound of the rain. All of it melted into the background as her focus locked on the boy. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. All she knew was that she had to do something. Anything. She couldn't let him stand there. Couldn't let him win. Without thinking, she bolted for the door. Her co-workers called after her, their voices distant and muffled, like they were coming from underwater. The moment she stepped outside, the rain hit her like a slap, cold and relentless. She didn't care. Her eyes searched the street frantically, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sound of the rain. There he was, still standing in the same spot, his grin never faltering. The world around them seemed to blur, the colors muted, the sounds distant. It was just her and the boy, locked in a silent, unspoken confrontation. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The rain mixed with the tears streaming down her face, but she didn't notice. She took a step forward, her feet splashing in the growing puddles. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The boy said nothing. His grin widened, if that were even possible, and his eyes seemed to glisten, reflecting the stormy sky above. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if amused. She couldn't stand it. She had to get closer, had to make him explain. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her off the curb and into the street. The rain was deafening now, the sound of it pounding against the pavement and the windows around them. She was halfway across the street when she heard it, a sharp, blaring horn that pierced through the storm. She turned her head just in time to see the headlights barreling toward her. Time seemed to slow as the realization hit. She tried to move, but it was too late. The impact came fast, the world spinning in a blur of light and sound before everything went dark. She woke to a blinding whiteness and the sterile smell of antiseptic. The faint hum of machines surrounded her, their rhythmic beeps syncing with a dull ache that pulsed through her body. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her mind felt foggy, disoriented, as though she had been pulled from a dream too soon. Then it all came flooding back. The rain, the boy, the headlights, and the sharp sound of the car's horn. Her fingers twitched against the stiff hospital sheets. She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff and sore, and blinked against the harsh light overhead. A nurse appeared by her bedside, her kind smile doing little to ease the unease that gripped her chest. "You're lucky," the nurse said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "You were struck by a car, but no major injuries. Just a concussion and a few bruises. Rest, and you'll be fine." Struck by a car. The words felt hollow, distant. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything that made sense. "The boy," she croaked, her throat dry and scratchy. "Did anyone see the boy?" The nurse's brow furrowed. "What boy?" She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "The boy. He was in the street, standing in the rain. He was there. You must have seen him." The nurse hesitated, her expression shifting to something more cautious. "There was no one in the street but you," she said gently. "When the paramedics arrived, you were alone." Alone. The word echoed in her mind, clashing against the vivid memory of those black eyes, that too wide grin. Oh. She hadn't imagined it. She couldn't have. She pressed her palms against her forehead, trying to steady her thoughts, but the questions kept coming. Had anyone else seen him? A passerby? The driver? But every answer was the same. No one had seen a boy. No one believed her. When the nurse left, the silence in the room grew unbearable. The beeping of the machine seemed louder now, more oppressive. She turned her head toward the window, the only source of light in the dim hospital room. The rain had stopped, leaving faint streaks on the glass. But as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she noticed something else. Smudges. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the faint, greasy marks on the glass. They were small, almost childlike, as if someone had pressed their hands against the window, looking in. A shiver ran down her spine. She tried to dismiss it, to convince herself it was nothing, but the unease gnawed at her. She closed her eyes, but the boy's face was waiting for her in the darkness. The pale skin, the wet, matted hair, and those eyes, bottomless, soulless, filled with something she couldn't name. His grin stretched wider in her mind, mocking her, daring her to question her own sanity. For days, she stayed in the hospital, but the unease never left her. The smudges on the window vanished the next morning, cleaned away by a diligent custodian. No one else had seen them. No one else believed her when she tried to explain. Maybe it was the concussion, the doctor suggested, his tone laced with pity. Your mind playing tricks on you. But she knew better. The memory was too vivid, too real. The boy was real. He had to be. When she finally returned to her apartment, she found herself avoiding the windows, keeping the curtains drawn tightly shut at all hours. But it didn't matter. She could still feel his presence, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. And every night, in the silence of her room, she would hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Let me in. Was it a ghost? A hallucination? Or something far more sinister? To this day, she doesn't know. All she knows is that she will never forget the boy, his eyes, his grin, and the knocking. She will never forget the knocking. The soft, persistent tapping, the black eyes staring through the glass, the eerie grin that haunts her dreams. The boy may be gone, or perhaps he's just waiting, outside someone else's window. If this tale sent chills down your spine, remember, there are more stories just like this, waiting for you in the dark corners of Eerie Road Tales. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. After all, you never know when a knock at your window might become more than just the wind. Until next time, stay safe, keep your lights on, and whatever you do, keep your windows locked. If you're thrilled by this story and crave more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. Hit the bell icon, and join us for more stories that will keep you on edge night after night.